Imagine that somewhere, in a room you will never enter, a few hundred people are sitting in silence. No candles, no speeches, no chanting loud enough to shake the air. Only breath, stillness, attention. And yet, according to one of the strangest ideas ever proposed in modern consciousness research, that quiet room may not be quiet at all. It may be broadcasting, not with electricity, not with language, not even with intention in the ordinary sense, but with coherence, a kind of invisible order that, if the old claim is true, does not stop at the walls. It spills into neighborhoods, into streets, into the emotional weather of a city. This is the story of the Maharishi Effect, the proposition that when enough people enter deep meditation together, the wider collective becomes less turbulent, less violent, less frayed. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who brought Transcendental Meditation to the West, framed the idea first around 1% of a population, and later around a much smaller threshold for group practice, the square root of 1%. Within that tradition, the claim is simple and enormous at the same time. A tiny island of inner order can change the sea around it. Whether you hear that as science, myth, prayer, or impossible poetry depends on the room you carry inside you. But before we decide what to call it, it is worth noticing something older and stranger. Humanity has been circling this intuition for a very long time. Again and again, across traditions, the same whisper returns. Consciousness may not be sealed. Peace may not be private. And what one person stabilizes inwardly may, under rare conditions, begin to radiate outward. The Maharishi Effect sounds modern because it borrows the language of population thresholds, experiments, and social indicators. But its emotional skeleton is ancient. In the Buddhist Metta Sutta, loving-kindness is not described as a private comfort technique. It is described as something to be extended without limit, across directions, across distance, across visible and invisible life. The old instruction is expansive, almost atmospheric. Radiate goodwill above, below, and across the entire world. In other words, the inner state of the practitioner is already being imagined as an environment. The same intuition appears in classical yoga. In the wider Yoga Sutra tradition, ahimsa, non-harm, is the first discipline and the root of the others. Later renderings of Sutra 2.35 say that when nonviolence is firmly established, hostility falls away in the presence of that person. Not because they argue better, not because they overpower anyone, but because their state changes the field around them. That is not yet the Maharishi Effect, but it is unmistakably an ancestor of it. Then history begins to echo this in social, rather than explicitly spiritual language. Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence describes the charged state that emerges when people gather in shared mood and shared attention. Later work sharpened the picture. Co-presence, rhythm, density, entrainment, and emotional contagion can create an intensified shared reality. In that sense, modern sociology quietly admits something mystical traditions said long ago. A group can become more than a sum. It can become a medium. And then, in the 20th century, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi made the leap from mythic intuition to social hypothesis. The TM research tradition says the first published city-level study found reduced crime after small cities crossed the 1% threshold of TM practitioners. Later reports expanded the claim to larger geographies. In Merseyside, a time series paper argued that crime reduction tracked the formation of a coherence-creating meditation group. In Jerusalem during the Lebanon conflict, A prospective study claimed reductions in conflict-related stress indicators during the period of group practice. And in Washington, D.C., in 1993, researchers reported that a large assembly of about 4,000 meditators coincided with a peak 23.3% decrease in homicide, rape, and assault crimes, with the paper modeling an overall violent crime reduction of 15.6%. If you listen closely, what makes these reports so eerie is not just the statistics. It is the implied architecture of reality. They are asking us to imagine that consciousness behaves less like a sealed lantern and more like weather. That fear can move through a population. That agitation can spread without permission. And therefore, perhaps, that calm could spread too. If panic is socially contagious, why must peace remain locked inside the individual skull? Modern phenomenology adds texture to that possibility. In qualitative meditation research, people often describe practice as making them kinder, calmer, less defensive, more relational. A 2024 interview study reported improved relationship quality, increased compassion, and a widening sense of spiritual awareness. A microphenomenology review described meditators moving from inner fragmentation toward a felt reunification of self and world. These are not city-level measurements. They are first-person accounts. But first-person accounts matter here, because the Maharishi Effect begins from a first-person proposition. That consciousness can become more ordered than it usually is. The same thing appears in collective contemplative settings that have nothing to do with TM. In a 2023 International Labyrinth Walking Study, hundreds of practitioners across 19 countries described connectedness, transcendence, positive emotion, and impulses toward compassionate action while walking in different places at the same time under a shared intention. That detail matters. Different places, same time, shared purpose. The phenomenology is already halfway to the Maharishi imagination. People report not merely feeling better, but feeling subtly linked. Not merely relaxed, but woven into something larger. So by the time we arrive at the phrase Maharishi Effect, the ground has already been prepared. Ancient religion says inner states radiate. Sociology says crowds cohere. Meditation research says the sense of self can thin and connectedness can intensify. Collective contemplative practice says shared intention can feel real even across distance. The Maharishi Effect sits where all of those streams briefly cross and asks a forbidden question in a very gentle voice. What if consciousness has range? Now we move into more dangerous territory. Not proof, not certainty, just a frontier where modern ideas start to leave the door slightly open. Start with the simplest bridge, collective intentionality. Philosophers use this term for the way minds can become jointly oriented toward the same thing, forming common ground, shared belief, shared emotion, and readiness for joint action. That alone does not produce a Maharishi Effect, but it breaks one old assumption, that consciousness is always a lonely, self-contained event. Even in mainstream philosophy, there's already room for minds to become structured together in a way that creates a social reality no single mind contains by itself. Then there is synchrony. When people move together, sing together, march together, drum together, or even breathe together, something measurable changes. In controlled experiments, synchrony increases cooperation and strengthens social attachment. In group drumming work, physiological and behavioral synchrony predict felt group cohesion. Meta-analytic reviews find that synchrony tends to increase bonding, prosocial behavior, social cognition, and positive effect. So here's one bridge. Maybe what contemplative traditions have long called harmony is not purely metaphorical. Maybe coherence is biologically and socially real, and groups are exquisitely sensitive to it. Meditation adds a second bridge by altering the structure of self-experience itself. Some mindfulness studies report reduced perceived body boundaries and more allocentric, less tightly self-centered spatial framing. Others suggest that decentering helps self-transcendent states emerge. Integrative reviews define self-transcendent experience in terms of reduced self-salience and increased connectedness. If the ordinary sense of I end here becomes softer under certain practices, then a worldview in which private consciousness is less private no longer feels quite as absurd from the inside. Then comes the stranger bridge, coherence in living systems. In the late 1960s, Herbert Froehlich proposed that under certain conditions, biological systems could exhibit forms of long-range coherent excitation. Decades later, the rise of quantum biology complicated the older assumption that life is too warm, wet, and noisy for subtle coherence to matter. The point is not that photosynthesis proves psychic fields. It is not. The point is humbler and more interesting. Nature may preserve order in places where older paradigms expected only noise. Once that door opens even slightly, the imagination of a consciousness-based field no longer lives entirely outside the map. The Maharishi tradition, of course, makes a bolder move. It says the source of mind and the source of natural law are the same underlying unified field, and that meditation allows consciousness to settle into that foundational layer. In that model, group practice does not create peace by broadcasting thoughts like radio waves. It creates peace by increasing coherence at the level where individual and collective consciousness already meet. You do not have to accept that framework to see why it has such strange staying power. It offers not merely a claim, but a metaphysic elegant enough to hold the claim. And then there is the anomalous cousin to all of this, the Global Consciousness Project, which since 1998 has kept a distributed network of random number generators and reports subtle departures from expectation during major events of shared global emotion and attention. Again, this is not the Maharishi Effect, but it is haunted by the same possibility. That collective mind, under rare conditions, may register outside the human body in ways faint, noisy, and difficult to interpret, yet not entirely dismissible as fantasy. So this is the frontier. Social science says coherence changes groups. Contemplative science says meditation changes the felt geometry of selfhood. Biophysics says life may be more coherence-dependent than once believed. Anomalous research asks whether large-scale shared attention can leave subtle signatures in matter-like systems. And the Maharishi Effect stand in the middle of all of that, saying, perhaps consciousness does not merely observe the world. Under the right conditions, perhaps it tunes it. Maybe the Maharishi Effect is a future science waiting for better instruments. Maybe it is an old spiritual intuition that temporarily borrowed the costume of statistics. Maybe it is both. But there is a deeper reason the idea lingers. It reverses one of the bleakest assumptions of modern life, that the only real forces are loud ones. Armies, markets, algorithms, propaganda, momentum. The Maharishi Effect proposes the opposite, that the deepest forces may be quiet, that reality may be more permeable to inward order than we were taught, that stillness, under the right conditions, is not an escape from the world, but a hidden way of entering it. And so the final question is not whether every paper convinces you, or whether every mechanism is known. The final question is simpler and stranger. If fear can spread through a city without touching every door, If anger can move invisibly from nervous system to nervous system, if a crowd can become one atmosphere, then why should peace be the one human state with no field, no echo, no reach? Somewhere tonight, perhaps in Iowa, perhaps in Delhi, perhaps in a room with no sign on the door, people sit down together and close their eyes. The city around them keeps humming. Traffic flows. Screens flicker. Somewhere a siren turns a corner. And yet the old possibility remains, as beautiful as it is unconfirmed, that consciousness, when gathered and quieted, might not disappear into the dark at all. It might begin, very softly, to change the shape of the dark itself.